Hey, welcome back. In this session, we're going to be looking at personal computers. We're looking at computers in general, but we're going to focus on personal computers. Okay, introduction here. Computers process, store, and transmit information. Central to all modern communication networks, and they connect people, organizations, and systems worldwide. I think you know all those things, okay? But just to get us started. Now, I'm going to take a look at the history of the industry. And what we're going to find out is that smaller, faster, smarter is always the key. And mobiles make up 60% of the devices. And the best-selling one of all time was the Commodore 64, which was one of the first ones. Okay, we have a market share of over $200 billion. So the computer is pretty important. Now, I mentioned Herman Hollerith. He created a calculator to help count the census in 1890. His company eventually became IBM, even though he wasn't really in charge of it. But anyway, he created what a lot of people call the first computer, and it was back in the 19th century. He was working for the government to help count the census, and he actually had data in a memory. He created a device that actually had a memory, which helped him count the census because it was taking more than 10 years to count the census back in the 19th, because as we kept growing and we were doing it by hand still, had to change something. So he came along. Good for him. He also had a central processing unit, which is a key part of any computer. And his output was into a special format. And like I said, his company eventually became IBM. Now, if we're going to define the computer just so we can be specific about what we're talking about, because some people would say Hollerith wasn't really a computer. Okay, anyway, it's an electronic device that processes data into meaningful information. It handles input, processing, output, and storage. And we're going to talk about all those things in this series of talks. It's essential for interpersonal, organizational, and mass communication. It is now because it has been integrated into our society so specifically. Now, in the early history of computing, you see I have a bunch of things here on the screen. From the 1940s to the 50s, when the first digital computers emerged, the ENIAC came out in 1946. It was 30 tons, vacuum tubes, military use. You had to go, it was a huge monstrosity. And it used with the vacuum tubes could process about a couple thousand calculations a second, which was pretty good. Not near as good as what we can do today, but it was pretty good. In 1947, they invented the transistor, which began the miniaturization of computers, making them smaller. Without transistors, we wouldn't have transistor radios, which I don't know if you ever had a transistor radio or not, but I had one when I was a kid. In 1958, we invented the transistors. So you take the the integrated circuit. You could then put all your transistors on a single chip, and you didn't have to have all these vacuum tubes and everything every place. So the CPU then goes from the size of a building to the size of a wafer. The motherboards haul the circuits, limited capacity, but it's groundbreaking. I have a graphic I'll show you about this probably in the second session. Here's what it looked like. You were actually inside the computer to work on it. It was huge. And all these vacuum tubes and wires, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that was the age of the mainframe, 1950s and 60s, large centralized systems. They were used by governments and corporations. Banks were a big user, and some universities. We were doing research with them. Some of the examples, IBM 704 was a huge seller, very popular computer, and so was the UNIVAC. UNIVAC came along around 1953. But all these computers, these mainframes, UNIVACs, whatever, required climate control and skilled operators. You had to be a computer scientist. You still have computer scientists today, but back then a computer scientist was a guy who he always wore white coats like they were doctors or something, but they had to be very skilled. And that was true, I'd say, up until the 1990s. Okay, many computers came along, many, M-I-N-I. Smaller, cheaper alternatives to mainframes. Everybody didn't need what the mainframe could do. U of L had one. They had a DEC. U of L had a DEC 10. The school I went, we had a DEC 20. DEC was their EUC DEC PDP 8, which was invented in 1965. It popularized distributed computing. In other words, not just having one computer, having multiple computers. It allowed labs and smaller firms to use computation. It also allowed universities to have labs, which was very important. Okay, we moved into the 70s with the Intel 4004 revolutionized the computer. That's chip, that real small chip that we could put into a small computer. So Apple II, IBM PC, Commodore 64, those were three computers that emerged in the 70s and 80s. Apple II, of course, very famous. It was, but these small computers, I should say, made computing. The first computers, the Apple II, the IBM, not the IBM, I'm sorry, the Commodore, were seen as toys more than tools. But when the MITS Altair 8800 came out in 1975, that was really what they called the first personal computer. It wasn't a toy, although it didn't have any programs, and you couldn't run any languages on it. So the Apple II came about in 1977. There was an original Apple, and then they added Apple II. And it was a leader in itself until about into the early 80s, when the IBM computer was introduced in 81, and it used the Intel chip. And then there was tons of clones followed. I mentioned in the previous lecture, the National Cash Register, HP and Dell and Olivetta had one. A lot of just a lot of companies went into the computer business. Okay. So I'm going to stop right there for a few minutes. I'm going to stop here for the first session. We'll come back with the second session and we'll get involved. In the second session, we're going to start talking about the personal computer specifically and not the history of computing. Okay, so I'll see you in a few minutes.